justice. Now she's hailed as a symbol of clarity and courage, while Whoopi's empire crumbles. How did one woman turn a national smear campaign into the most unexpected comeback of the decade? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The once unshakable throne of the Forum with Whoopi Goldberg was starting to creak. Behind its polished desk and rehearsed smiles, the truth was unavoidable. The numbers were crashing. Ratings weren't just dipping, they were bleeding. Once the crown jewel of opinion-led television, Whoopi's show had become another relic in a world that now demanded outrage over nuance, spectacle over wisdom. Week after week, producers watched in silence as viewer counts slid into the red. Advertisers began pulling out, first quietly, then boldly. Emails went unanswered. Meetings got shorter. The production floor, once humming with excitement, now buzzed with the cold anxiety of uncertainty. Even her longtime network allies had begun floating cautious phrases like, "pivot the brand," or worse, "bring in fresh energy." Everyone knew what that meant. Whoopi wasn't naive. She saw it coming. She'd spent decades navigating this industry, watching the tides shift, watching icons fall. But she'd never imagined it would come for her like this. Slow, humiliating, a fade rather than a finale. She wasn't ready to become background noise. Not yet. But to stay in the game, she needed something explosive. Something no one could ignore. Not another thoughtful academic. Not a celebrity plugging their cookbook. She needed a name that could set social media on fire. A spark that could erupt into a cultural flashpoint and remind the world that Whoopi still had pull. That she could still make people watch and make them argue about what they saw. And that's when Jasmine Crockett's name entered the room. Young, fiery, fearless. Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a phenomenon. She didn't ask for attention, she commanded it. With a stare that could silence a room and words that cut straight through political noise, she had become the unfiltered voice of a new generation. Her speeches were clipped into TikToks. Her interviews became trending Twitter threads. Every appearance she made was instantly repackaged into viral media, either adored or attacked, but always watched. She had something rare in politics: cultural velocity. Every sentence she spoke was raw material for millions of views. To Whoopi, Jasmine wasn't just a guest. She was an opportunity, a walking lightning rod, a one-woman news cycle. And if things were handled just right, Jasmine could be the jolt that jump-started the dying engine of the Forum. Jasmine stirred controversy. Controversy drew attention. Attention brought viewers back to their screens. Viewers drove up ratings. And high ratings meant advertisers, sponsors, dollars. In a crumbling empire of television, money was the only thing that could buy survival. The plan wrote itself. Invite her onto the show under the guise of solidarity, a generational conversation, women of color in power, unity across decades. Make it feel warm, safe. Make Jasmine let her guard down? But beneath that surface, Whoopi and her producers had already begun laying traps. A lineup of carefully worded questions, seemingly harmless, but purposefully shaped to press against Jasmine's pressure points. Systemic distrust, race, faith, political hypocrisy. The kind of questions that could draw an honest answer. The kind of honesty that could be twisted. The team was briefed. Editors were given timestamps to watch for. The moment Jasmine's tone cracked or her face sharpened. The precise second her passion might read. To the uninformed, like defiance. A 15-second segment would be enough. Just enough. The tech team was set to clip and export in real time. Social media managers had captions pre-written. Thumbnail images had been pre-selected, strategic hashtags tested. Back-channel calls made to media friends who would push the narrative the moment it dropped. Whoopi didn't even need Jasmine to make a mistake, just to say something real. The internet would do the rest. There was no interest in understanding her, no curiosity about her experience. Jasmine wasn't a guest. She was a spark plug, a calculated risk, a pawn in a ratings war. And she didn't even know it. Because for Whoopi, this wasn't about principle. It wasn't about policy. It was about keeping her throne. This industry doesn't reward nuance. It rewards the moment. Jasmine Crockett, whether she knew it or not, was about to become the moment. And the truth? It didn't have to survive the edit. Only the reaction did. Whether she's right or wrong doesn't matter, Whoopi had said coldly in a closed-door meeting. What matters is the audience will argue, and the money will start flowing. The stage had been set, the trap laid in silence. But Jasmine Crockett walked into that studio unaware, armed only with truth, conviction, and the dangerous belief that she was there to be heard. She walked in with nothing but purpose. Jasmine Crockett, congresswoman, firebrand, believer in words, justice, and the raw possibility of public discourse, stepped onto the soundstage of the forum with Whoopi Goldberg like someone entering sacred ground. To her, this wasn't just another interview. It was an opportunity to share her vision, to challenge cynicism with clarity, to speak not as a politician, but as a woman who knew the cost of silence. She had reviewed her notes, chosen her words carefully, even practiced her smile in the mirror. She believed this would be a space of mutual respect, a meeting of minds between two women of color, two generations of fighters. She believed that Whoopi, an icon she had once admired from afar, would hold space for her voice. Jasmine had no idea she was walking into an ambush masked as conversation. The lights were warm, the audience clapped politely, and Whoopi greeted her like an old friend. Her tone was smooth, her gestures slow and elegant, like a queen still in command of her court. Jasmine sat, relaxed but attentive, heart steady. The opening questions came easy. Compliments, nostalgia, stories from Jasmine's past. It was soft, gentle, almost maternal. But Jasmine didn't realize that kindness in this room was just the bait, because soon the tone shifted, not abruptly, not obviously, but with the precision of a scalpel. The smile stayed on Whoopi's lips, but her eyes sharpened. The phrasing of her questions began to bend, just slightly, like a blade curved at the tip. You've made waves speaking about systemic inequality, Whoopi began, voice calm. But do you think that sometimes your tone alienates the people you're trying to reach? It was a trap dressed in velvet. Then came another. Do you believe in the Constitution? Or do you think the system was never built for people like us? Another incision, and another. You talk about faith. But isn't faith just another illusion when power doesn't change? Jasmine answered with composure, but the undercurrent was shifting. The questions weren't built for truth. They were built to twist. Whoopi's tone never changed, but her words became landmines, and Jasmine could feel the terrain shifting beneath her. She was being pushed, slowly, deliberately, toward the edge of a soundbite, toward that one moment that could be snipped, ripped from context, and weaponized. She wasn't being interviewed. She was being cornered, set up. And no matter how poised she remained, the audience wouldn't see the trap. They'd only see her reaction. In that room full of cameras, wires, and agendas, Jasmine realized she wasn't here to be heard. She was here to be used. She had tried to stay composed, to steer the conversation toward solutions, not wounds. But pressure has a way of breaking even the strongest structures, not through chaos, but through silence, through that tightening, invisible grip of being constantly misunderstood. Jasmine could feel it in her chest. The cameras, the careful smiles, the falsely warm questions. Everything in this room was starting to press in, squeezing her truth into a corner. And so, she did what they never expected. She stopped defending. She let go of caution. She let the truth rise unfiltered. Her voice didn't rise. Her tone didn't harden. But her words cut through the air like a blade, too honest to soften. I don't believe in this system, she said slowly. Not because I hate it, but because it was never designed for someone like me. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just exhaustion, just clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't scream, it sinks. Her eyes didn't dart, her hands didn't clench. But the weight of that sentence, years of history wrapped into one breath, hung in the air like thunder without sound. And for a moment, just a heartbeat, the room seemed to freeze. No coughs, no shifts in the audience seats. Even the cameras seemed to pause, as if stunned by what they'd just captured. But across the table, Whoopi didn't blink. She didn't nod. She didn't speak. She smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that says, "I understand." It was the kind that says, "Gotcha." A smile sharpened by calculation. Quiet, triumphant, predatory. Because that sentence, those 15 carefully spoken words, were exactly what she had been waiting for. Months of planning, weeks of script shaping, hours of question rehearsal, all of it had led to this. Not a scream, not a scandal, a moment of vulnerability, of truth, and that made it even more valuable. The control room lit up immediately. Red lights on the cameras flared bright. Producers sat forward in their chairs, headphones pressed tight to their ears. They didn't need to say it out loud. That's the one. The footage was already being marked, time-stamped, backed up, transferred. This was it, the clip that would be stripped of context, uploaded in seconds, and broadcast to millions. Congresswoman admits she doesn't believe in America. The headline was practically writing itself before she even finished her sentence. Jasmine had poured her lived experience into a line meant to invite reflection, and in return, they would carve it into a weapon. There was no space here for the complexity behind her words. No interest in why she felt that way. No curiosity about the layers of history, exclusion, struggle, and hope that lived inside that single sentence. In that moment, Jasmine didn't yet realize what had happened. To her, she had simply spoken from her core, a truth shaped by everything she'd seen, fought for, lost. But to the machine, to the stage she'd unknowingly stepped onto, she had just given them gold. Not honesty, not justice, content. Something to package, distort, distribute. She had opened her heart, and they had already decided how to sell it. Less than 24 hours later, the clip detonated across the internet. Not the full moment, not the context. Just one line, ripped from her voice like a weapon. "I don't believe in this system." Stripped of its second half, stripped of its soul. It appeared first as a short video on an anonymous Twitter account, watermarked with bold red letters, "Jasmine Crockett exposed." Within minutes, it was picked up by political bloggers, YouTube commentators, and Instagram meme pages. The captions were brutal, the headlines worse. Anti-American Congresswoman revealed. She hates the country that elected her. What was meant as a cry for change became a viral accusation. Within an hour, her face was plastered on a dozen thumbnails, each freeze frame capturing her in mid-sentence, twisted to look smug, cold, or ungrateful. Comment sections exploded with fury. Her inbox turned into a war zone. News anchors began quoting her. Never the whole sentence, never the truth, just the edit, again and again, like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom she never walked into. And Jasmine? She found out not from her staff, not from an alert, but from a stranger's text. A screenshot of a post already past 200,000 shares. Her chest tightened. The breath left her body as if someone had pulled it out with a hook. She clicked the link, watched the clip, and didn't even recognize herself. It was her voice, her face, her words, but mutilated, hollowed out, weaponized. She had trusted the stage to hold her story. Instead, they had mined her truth for headlines and built a lie in its place. And the worst part wasn't the betrayal, it was how easily people believed it, as if the real her, the thoughtful her, the whole her, had never even existed. But what began as a viral clip quickly mutated into something far more dangerous, something carefully orchestrated, fed by familiar hands with polished knives. The moment the video hit critical mass, the vultures descended, professional, well-dressed, and coordinated. News anchors with decades of camera polish and practiced neutrality suddenly broke into moral outrage, their voices shaking with just enough performance to convince the average viewer it was genuine. Jasmine's quote, ripped out of context, drained of its meaning, was now being played on a loop like a criminal confession. The networks that had always fawned over Whoopi, praised her as a national treasure, now took their cue from her silence and moved in for the kill. Congresswoman questions Constitution. Is she the real threat to democracy? One headline simply read, "Disgrace in the House." It wasn't analysis, it was execution. Even journalists who had interviewed Jasmine before, who had once praised her courage, turned cold. The groupthink was swift and merciless. No one wanted to be left behind when the narrative train left the station. Some simply ignored the full footage. Others knew exactly what they were doing. Either way, the result was the same. Jasmine Crockett was no longer a person. She was a symbol, a headline, a scandal, a name to shout over B-roll footage of burning flags and protest footage. Footage that had nothing to do with her, but now lived beside her name forever. And the most painful part? None of them had called her. Not one outlet, not one friend in the media asked for her side. They didn't want clarity, they wanted controversy. The backlash moved faster than anything Jasmine had ever experienced. Within 12 hours, her office was overwhelmed. Voicemails full of shouting, emails full of slurs, comments full of venom. People who had never watched the full segment, never followed her work, never heard her fight for their rights, now called her a traitor. Strangers told her to go back to where she came from, as if she hadn't been born on the very soil they claimed to defend. People twisted her identity, her skin color, her role in government into a weapon against her. She wasn't just being criticized, she was being erased, rewritten, repackaged into something monstrous, and sold to the public as fact. Even inside Congress, the air shifted. Some colleagues looked away in elevators. Some avoided her entirely. Others, those with more to lose, issued vague, performative statements about concerns over rhetoric. She wasn't just under attack from the outside anymore. The betrayal was coming from within, from people who had smiled to her face only weeks before. And Jasmine, standing in the middle of it all, realized something terrifying. It didn't matter what she had meant. It only mattered what they wanted her to mean. Her truth had been consumed, and in its place they had built a lie large enough to bury her. But just when Jasmine thought the narrative couldn't be twisted any further, Whoopi struck with the final blow. The move no one saw coming, but everyone felt. It started with a quiet headline on a legal blog. Just a whisper. Then the whisper turned into thunder. Whoopi Goldberg was suing Jasmine Crockett. The official statement landed like a grenade. Jasmine was being accused of knowingly and recklessly using a national broadcast platform to promote messaging harmful to the public and damaging to the reputation of the program and its host. The wording was precise, weaponized. It was written to sound noble, protective, like Whoopi was defending journalism itself. But beneath the surface, it was something far more dangerous. A calculated character assassination delivered in legalese. The media, already frothing at the mouth, went into a frenzy. Headlines flashed like emergency lights. Whoopi takes legal action. Jasmine Crockett, from star to defendant? Was it all a setup? Every network covered it. Every commentator had an opinion. And none of them, not a single one, played the full quote. The lawsuit gave weight to the lie. It didn't matter that Jasmine had never broken a single rule, never said anything untrue, never acted in bad faith. The accusation alone was enough to brand her, to tarnish her name in ink that didn't wash off. Her team scrambled. Lawyers made statements. Publicists begged networks to host the full clip. But no one listened, because no one wanted clarity. They wanted chaos. They wanted blood. Online, the outrage metastasized. Hashtag after hashtag buried her, cancel Crockett, boycott Jasmine, traitor in Congress. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Threats poured in by the hundreds, some vague, some detailed, some too personal to ignore. And every hour the numbers grew, not of supporters, but of enemies she'd never met, voices she'd never heard, people who now hated her based on a sentence she hadn't even finished. The professional world began to turn on her too. Quiet cancellations came first, calls that never returned, emails that dried up. Then came the open ones. One by one, conferences withdrew her name from their lineups. Universities released public statements saying they were reevaluating their partnerships. Even nonprofits she had helped raise funding for sent carefully worded emails cutting ties. Endorsements evaporated, brand deals vanished. People she had mentored stopped replying. Colleagues in Congress avoided her in the halls. A few unfollowed her in silence. A few issued cold public statements cloaked in political neutrality. We do not condone rhetoric that undermines American institutions, as if she had ever done anything but fight for them to work better. And Jasmine? She sat in the middle of it all, watching her life unravel, not because of a crime, not because of a mistake, but because of a decision. Someone else's decision to twist her truth into a weapon. She was being erased in real time, not just from television or public events or headlines, but from trust, from credibility, from the right to speak without fear. And the cruelest part? No one wanted to know what she really said. They just wanted to be first to punish her for what she didn't. To the outside world, Jasmine had vanished. But in the shadows, something far more dangerous than silence was taking shape. She went dark, completely. No statements, no interviews, not a single tweet. For a woman known for her voice, sharp, passionate, unflinching, this sudden stillness felt like collapse. The media spun it instantly. Jasmine Crockett breaks under pressure. The rise and fall of a firebrand. Columnists wrote op-eds eulogizing her career, like she was already gone. Cable pundits debated how long it would take before she resigned. Even supporters began to wonder. Her silence became its own scandal, its own proof of guilt in a world that demanded instant reactions. The headlines turned her into a ghost. The public forgot how loudly a storm brews before it breaks. But behind closed doors, Jasmine wasn't falling apart. She was building a war room. Her apartment became command central. Curtains drawn, phones silenced, no cameras, just laptops glowing at midnight, coffee going cold, and her team running on adrenaline and grit. They weren't brainstorming sound bites. They were collecting facts, hard, irrefutable data, the raw, uncut studio footage, the production timelines, the full-length contract between her and the forum that confirmed no editorial manipulation was allowed without consent. They tracked IP logs from the original viral upload. They traced how the doctored clip was leaked, who first posted it, how fast it spread, which accounts amplified it, and which ones had prior links to Whoopi's media team. It was no longer just about clearing Jasmine's name. It was about proving what had really happened and who had made it happen. Every document was backed up twice. Every video file had timestamps cross-checked. Her lawyers flagged inconsistencies in the network's public statements. Her policy aides assembled a chronological map, down to the minute, of how her sentence had been turned into a weapon. They weren't working for headlines. They were working for truth, a truth that could no longer be spoken. It had to be shown. Jasmine barely slept, but she didn't complain. She didn't collapse. Because somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, the betrayal, the rage, she knew one thing with terrifying clarity. They thought she was quiet because she was broken, but she was quiet because she was aiming. And then, just when the silence had reached its peak, when the world had almost settled into her disappearance, Jasmine stepped back into the light, and this time, she brought the truth with her. The press didn't expect it. Not like this. Not after everything. At best, they thought it would be a soft apology, a plea for perspective, maybe even a resignation speech masked as reflection. But what they got was something entirely different. At exactly 10 a.m., Jasmine Crockett walked onto the stage of a small, unassuming conference hall in D.C. No grand banners, no PR flares, no handlers whispering in her ear. She wore a simple navy suit, no jewelry, no designer heels, just clarity in her posture and something colder than anger in her eyes. Behind her, a screen flickered to life, unedited, unaltered. The truth. The first words Jasmine spoke were quiet but sharp. This is not a defense. This is an exposure. She pressed play. The full, uncut video of her interview with Whoopi filled the screen behind her. Every pause, every breath, every carefully omitted sentence restored in real time. For the first time, the public saw the truth, how her words were thoughtful, measured, how the infamous quote had been part of a much longer, deeply personal statement. The difference was night and day. It was no longer debatable, no longer political. It was undeniable. The room fell still. The reporters who had once helped spread the edited version now sat frozen, their pens still, their expressions unsettled. Jasmine let the footage run without interruption. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. And then came phase two. Jasmine calmly opened a folder and held up a set of documents, projecting them one by one onto the screen. Internal emails, Slack messages, memos, all pulled directly from a whistleblower within the forum's production team. The evidence was damning. Phrases like trap questions, make her look like a radical, and flag this timestamp for social media edit. The emails weren't speculation. They were time-stamped, signed, and traced to Whoopi's senior producers. Then came the kill shot, a slide titled simply, The Upload Trail. Jasmine's team had performed a full digital forensic sweep. The very first upload of the manipulated video, traced to a burner Twitter account, which had been linked through a digital fingerprint to a freelance editor on Whoopi's payroll. It was a smoking gun, cold, clinical, undeniable. Jasmine didn't yell. She didn't need to. The power of the evidence echoed louder than outrage ever could. They didn't just edit my words, she said, looking directly into the cameras. They scripted my downfall, and they almost succeeded. Her voice didn't shake, but the room did. Reporters were stunned, not because they hadn't seen scandals before, but because they had helped create this one. They had repeated the headlines. They had run the clips. They had added fuel to a fire that was never hers. Now, faced with the receipts, they couldn't look away, and they couldn't look innocent. The fallout was immediate. Twitter turned upside down. Jasmine was right climbed past 1 million mentions in 2 hours. People who had attacked her began issuing public apologies. Sponsors who had walked away started making calls. Journalists who had dragged her name through the dirt began issuing clarifications, then retractions. The narrative didn't just shift, it imploded, and in its place stood the truth. Jasmine Crockett had not only survived the fire, she had walked out carrying proof of who started it. The evidence had spoken louder than any accusation ever could. And now, even the woman who lit the match was feeling the heat of the fire she couldn't control. In the end, there was no dramatic courtroom showdown, no televised apology, no reckoning in front of flashing cameras. Instead, Whoopi Goldberg's team filed the paperwork to quietly withdraw the lawsuit, tucked into the late-night court docket, with no press conference, no explanation. Just a retreat dressed up in silence. And when the world demanded a response, when even her own followers began to ask questions, a statement was released, short, impersonal, and hollow. We regret the controversy surrounding recent events and wish Congresswoman Crockett well in her ongoing work. No admission, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had actually happened. It was not accountability, it was strategy, a legal maneuver designed to preserve legacy, not to right a wrong. Every word had been scrubbed, filtered, and approved by a crisis management firm. It didn't sound like Whoopi. It didn't sound like justice. It sounded like fear disguised as grace. And yet Jasmine, standing on the other side of it all, vindicated but scarred, didn't respond with vengeance. She didn't smile for the cameras or use her victory as a weapon. She stood before reporters under the same harsh lights that once threatened to bury her and spoke not with rage, but with resolve. Her voice was steady. Her message was clear. "I don't need anyone destroyed," she said, pausing to let the silence breathe. "I just need the truth to be heard in full." There was no triumph in her tone, no performance, just a quiet clarity that landed heavier than any angry speech ever could. Because this wasn't about revenge, it never had been. It was about truth. And now that truth had finally broken through the noise, Jasmine refused to let it be twisted again. She didn't just walk away with her name restored. She walked away having reminded the world what integrity looks like when the spotlight burns hottest. But while her opponents had underestimated her resolve, the world had been watching, and what they saw in Jasmine wasn't scandal, but something they hadn't seen in a long time. Strength without ego, defiance without chaos, and truth without compromise. The shift was slow at first, like the turning of a tide far out at sea. Quiet, almost imperceptible. A few threads on Twitter, a couple of TikTok creators revisiting the full video and breaking down the truth, frame by frame. Then came the independent journalists, The ones who hadn't bought into the outrage machine. They started asking real questions, digging deeper, connecting the dots. The receipts were undeniable, and so was the dignity Jasmine carried in the face of it all. Where others might have lashed out, she stood still. Where others would have spiraled, she had simply waited. Now that stillness was being seen for what it truly was. Not silence, but power held in reserve. And the people, long trained to expect theatrics and flame wars, saw something rare in Jasmine Crockett. Composure under fire, principle without performance. And it struck a chord in a country exhausted by noise. Suddenly, she wasn't just cleared. She was remembered and reclaimed. Commentators began using new language to describe her. Not divisive, not radical, but measured, unshakable, surgical. Op-eds once filled with speculation about her downfall now carried headlines like, "The Grace of Jasmine Crockett," and "In the Fire, She Stood Still." Artists began sketching portraits of her, turning that now famous press conference into painted murals and digital posters. College students quoted her in papers and protests. Her line, "I don't need anyone destroyed. I just need the truth to be heard in full," became a rallying cry in spaces that had once mocked her. It appeared on protest signs, screen-printed T-shirts, even projected onto the sides of buildings in cities she'd never even visited. People who had never followed politics, who had never even registered to vote, now saw Jasmine not as a politician, but as a reminder that survival doesn't have to come at the cost of your soul. She had become something more than a headline. She had become a mirror. A mirror for every person who had ever been misquoted, misunderstood, or misrepresented. A mirror for every woman told she was too much when she was right and not enough when she refused to scream. A mirror for every person of color whose truth was turned into controversy, whose honesty was framed as threat. Jasmine's composure was not just her strength, it was her message. She didn't need to yell to be heard. She didn't need to burn bridges to stand her ground. She had done what so few could. She had let the lie fall apart on its own, and when it did, she stood right where they tried to bury her, taller than before. The public's response was electric. Hashtags flipped almost overnight. Jasmine was right. Grace, under fire. The full sentence. Influencers posted apology videos. Celebrities who had once stayed quiet now spoke up in her favor, calling her a master class in restraint and the future of leadership. Book deals came in. Invitations to global summits followed. She was asked to speak at Harvard, then Oxford, then the UN. Not because she begged for attention, but because she had earned it through the quiet thunder of truth. She didn't ask to become a symbol. She didn't market herself as a brand. But that's what made her real, and that's why people listened. But Jasmine never let the attention distract her from the scar beneath it all. Because while the world now applauded her grace, she remembered the silence when she was drowning. She remembered who abandoned her, who stayed quiet, who pushed her closer to the edge. She didn't name names. She didn't keep a blacklist. But she remembered, and that memory fueled her not with bitterness, but with clarity. She didn't want revenge. She wanted prevention. She didn't want to be the last person who survived a machine like this. She wanted to be the reason fewer people got fed to it in the first place. So while the world cheered, Jasmine went to work. Policy meetings, media ethics committees, coalition building. She took the attention and turned it into structure. She took the moment and turned it into momentum. And for those who had tried to break her, there was no response left, no angle to spin, no counterattack to launch. Because Jasmine hadn't just survived their narrative, she had rewritten it. Not with fury, not with spectacle, but with precision, with patience, with proof. She had walked into the lion's den, been mauled by headlines, betrayed by voices once called friends, and still, she had refused to let her story be told by someone else's script. And in doing so, she became something the political world hadn't seen in far too long. Not a star, not a savior, but a standard. A woman who held the line not with her fists, but with her spine. And the world, it finally stood still long enough to notice. While Jasmine rose from the ashes, steadier and more respected than ever, The flames that had nearly consumed her began creeping backward, toward the hands that had tried to light them in the first place. At first, it was just a dip, small, quiet, deniable. A few thousand viewers here, a couple of sponsors pausing payments there. Nothing Whoopi's team hadn't seen before in the ever-fluctuating tide of media ratings. But this wasn't a fluctuation. This was a fracture, and it was spreading. Week by week, the numbers began slipping further. Viewers weren't just tuning out, they were turning against. They didn't forget how the clip was cut. They didn't forget the lawsuit. They didn't forget the silence when Jasmine was being buried under a lie. Social media had receipts, and they weren't letting go. Suddenly, every episode felt forced. Every monologue sounded rehearsed. The magic, the gravitas, the sense that Whoopi was untouchable, was gone. And it wasn't just because of what she did, it was because she didn't own it. Networks noticed, quietly at first, then bluntly. Execs who once bragged about locking in Whoopi's loyalty started reassigning producers and canceling internal renewals. Her name stopped appearing on shortlist invites for major panels and award shows. Emails once filled with praise now came with bullet points and requests for fresh direction. Advertisers began dropping off like flies. First, it was a skincare brand, citing a need to refocus on trust-driven marketing. Then it was a major streaming sponsor, referencing brand risk assessments. By the third week, 5 more sponsors pulled out, some publicly, others with legalese so vague it practically whispered shame. Her studio's inbox became a minefield of refunds, cancellations, and inquiries they couldn't spin. She had built a reputation on calling out injustice, but now her silence was the scandal. And the audience? They didn't just walk away, they flipped the narrative. Hashtags once used to promote her show became warning signs. # manipulated media. # accountability isn't optional. # full context only. Fan forums turned sour. Ratings dropped below survivable levels. Clips from her show that once racked up millions of views now struggled to break 5 digits. Comment sections were flooded with questions she never answered. Why didn't you let Jasmine speak? Why did you file that lawsuit? Why didn't you tell the truth? The same media machine she'd once commanded so effortlessly had turned. And this time, it wasn't taking sides. It was demanding answers. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere inside the forum turned toxic. Staff meetings grew shorter, colder. Whispers filled hallways. People who had once hung on to Whoopi's every word now spoke in hushed tones about what came next. Morale cracked. Editors resigned. The show's lead researcher walked out midweek and posted a viral resignation letter titled, "I can't spin the truth anymore." Even network insiders, those who had spent years protecting her legacy, began distancing themselves, leaking details to the press in hopes of escaping the fallout. And Whoopi? She tried to carry on. She delivered her opening monologues with the same tone, the same gestures, but now it all felt hollow. The spark was gone. The authority wasn't there. She could feel it, even if she wouldn't say it out loud. The room no longer belonged to her. Each new episode felt like a countdown to something inevitable. A public correction, a forced hiatus, a quiet end to what was once a roaring empire. She had once called herself a truth teller, but when it mattered most, she protected the lie. And now the truth had come to collect. The same producers who once helped build her throne were now discussing how to phase her out. Slowly, gently, respectfully. To protect the brand, they whispered in boardrooms. But no one said it to her face, because no one needed to. The writing was everywhere, across the ratings charts, in the backlash reports, in the sudden coldness of longtime colleagues. What had once been her stage was now a waiting room, and Jasmine's name was on everyone's lips. Not because Whoopi invited her in, but because Whoopi tried to shut her down. The irony stung the most. Whoopi had spent a lifetime fighting for voices like Jasmine's, but when that voice dared speak with a clarity she couldn't control, she chose silence over solidarity, control over conscience. And the world saw it. They saw how power defends itself, even if it means rewriting someone else's story. And now that same power was unraveling, thread by thread, in front of the same cameras that once made her a household name. This wasn't cancel culture. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence. And it didn't come in the form of outrage. It came in something quieter, colder, irrelevance. The audience had turned off the channel. The sponsors had closed their checkbooks. And Whoopi, for the first time in her storied career, stood on a stage that no longer listened. She hadn't been taken down by a scandal. She had been taken down by a sentence. One she didn't say. One she didn't own. One she tried to erase. But the world remembered. And the world chose to walk away. As the cameras that once tried to erase her turned away from the collapsing stage behind her, they found something far more compelling in front of them. Jasmine Crockett. Not as a victim, but as a voice the world could no longer afford to ignore. Her rise wasn't manufactured. It wasn't orchestrated by handlers or media consultants. It wasn't built on PR stunts or sympathy. It was forged in fire. Quiet, unrelenting fire. The same world that once hunted her for a headline now turned to her for answers. Invitations began to pour in, not from talk shows looking to squeeze more controversy, but from thinkers, scholars, leaders who had seen in her something rare. A survivor who didn't just survive, but translated pain into purpose. TED was first, then Aspen, then the Global Forum for Media Justice. One by one, the world's biggest platforms extended their stages, not as charity, but as recognition. Jasmine Crockett had become a global example, not just of resilience, but of strategic, disciplined defiance. She hadn't fought the machine by breaking it. She had exposed it, piece by piece, calmly, methodically. And in doing so, she gave a new generation something radical to believe in, that you could speak with power without raising your voice. At her first TED Talk, they gave her the final slot, the closer. The audience was full of diplomats, technologists, journalists, and students. The tension in the air wasn't the kind born of celebrity. It was respect, the kind earned, the kind that sticks. She stepped onto that stage without a script in her hands. She didn't need one. She carried her story like armor. The room hushed. The red circle beneath her feet glowed. And when she spoke, she didn't talk about revenge. She didn't name names. She didn't rehash the pain. She spoke about the architecture of manipulation, the economy of distortion, the slow erasure of integrity in a world too hungry for spectacle to wait for substance. And then she said the words that would echo long after the applause died down. The truth always has a sound, but you have to be patient enough to hear it rising through the noise. The audience didn't just clap. They stood. Some cried. Some stayed after just to thank her for surviving, for staying calm when the world wanted fire, for reminding them that real power doesn't scream, it endures. The quote went viral, not like a meme, but like a movement, painted on walls in Brazil, projected on buildings in Berlin, quoted by teachers, students, journalists. It was printed on protest signs and stitched into jackets. It became a kind of permission for anyone who had ever been told their tone was too soft, their pace too slow, their words too careful. Jasmine had become proof that stillness was not weakness. It was force under control. The world began to reframe her not just as a politician, but as a philosopher of modern justice. She didn't seek the spotlight, but wherever she went, the light followed. Not because she chased it, but because in an age built on performance, her authenticity was so rare, it became magnetic. Her voice didn't just cut through the noise, it made the noise irrelevant. She was invited to roundtables on algorithmic bias, disinformation, public trust. She joined panels with whistleblowers and digital watchdogs. And every time, no matter how complex the topic, she brought it back to one thing: clarity. Not just in speech, but in principle. But behind the elegance, the poise, the polished words, Jasmine never forgot the cost. She remembered what it felt like to be silenced not by a bullet, but by a narrative. To be judged not for what she said, but for how they chose to edit it. She remembered what it felt like to watch lies go viral while the truth waited in line. And so she never softened her spine. She never forgot the difference between applause and justice, between redemption and repair. And that's what made her dangerous in all the right ways, not to democracy, but to the machines that profit from misunderstanding. Back home, her office transformed. Constituents once distracted by the headlines now filled her inbox with gratitude, admiration, support. They brought her stories, not of outrage but of inspiration. Survivors of smear campaigns, teachers silenced for speaking up, parents whose children were being erased by online cruelty. And Jasmine answered every single one, not as a savior, not as a symbol, but as someone who had been there and made it through. She turned her attention toward building legislative protections against manipulated media. She pushed for digital transparency in journalism funding. She advocated for policy that demanded full footage in politically charged interviews. And she fought for something even rarer: time. Time to think, time to speak fully, time to be human in a world built for sound bites. International journalists began calling her the voice that waited. Law schools dissected her case as a modern example of media ethics and systemic power imbalance. She was invited to address parliaments overseas, not as an American congresswoman, but as a global case study in dignity under distortion. They showed the clip, the full one, every time. And every time someone in the room would gasp, not because of what she said, but because of what they remembered her being accused of. The gap between the truth and the version of it they had once believed was so wide, it made them look inward. And that was Jasmine's real gift, not just changing public perception, but forcing self-reflection. She didn't become famous. She became inevitable. A symbol not of scandal, but of how to survive one. Not of shouting matches, but of staying calm when your name is on fire. She didn't need to take down those who tried to bury her. The truth did it for her. And in every room she entered now, from university halls to UN panels, she brought with her not just a story, but a standard, that the truth, no matter how delayed, deserves to be heard without interruption. Jasmine Crockett had once been a headline, then a target, then a silence. And now she was a voice that could no longer be edited, and the world was finally listening. Jasmine Crockett never intended to start a movement. She didn't walk into that studio with dreams of reshaping public discourse or dismantling the silent machinery behind modern media. She walked in with truth, with clarity, with conviction. And for a moment, that almost wasn't enough. But the very fact that she survived what was designed to bury her, that she didn't just outlast the storm, but rewrote its direction, was precisely what gave her story power. The world had watched a woman be turned into a headline, watched her words be stripped and sold, and then watched her claw them back, one syllable at a time. It was never supposed to be this big. But once it was, Jasmine made sure it would matter. She made sure it wouldn't stop at vindication. Because for her, winning wasn't enough. It never had been. The system that almost erased her was still operating, still spinning, and she wasn't going to walk away while it was still aimed at someone else. What came next was not a public relations victory lap. Jasmine didn't hop from network to network basking in applause. She didn't sell her story for a miniseries or option a film deal. She went back to work. But now her work had changed. Her office became a war room, not for retaliation, but for reinvention. Policy was no longer just about budgets and bills. It was about barriers, the ones that silence people before they even get a chance to speak. She assembled a legal advisory board of media ethicists, digital rights lawyers, and social impact strategists. Together, they began crafting something few in Washington had the patience or courage to confront. Legislation that would hold platforms, networks, and producers accountable for distortion with intent. It was radical, it was risky, but it was real. The Clear Media Act was the first piece. On the surface, it was simple, a transparency mandate that required public interviews to include uncut, publicly accessible footage within 24 hours of air. But beneath that was a deeper structure, a web of accountability mechanisms built to slow down the abuse of editing power. It wasn't just about protecting public figures. It was about protecting the record. Jasmine's office opened the bill for public comment, and thousands responded. Teachers, nurses, teenagers, lawyers, veterans. Many of them had never written to Congress before, but they had stories about being misquoted in school board meetings, about having their live streams cut mid-sentence, about being turned into villains with a few well-placed edits. Jasmine read every story, She answered many herself, and when the bill finally reached the floor, she brought those stories with her, printed, highlighted, human. But the work didn't end there. Jasmine understood what many of her peers still didn't, that laws don't change culture unless culture is ready to uphold them. So she built the culture too. She worked with journalism schools across the country to implement new curriculum modules on digital ethics and manipulation in editing. She funded fellowships for young journalists, committed to full context reporting. She started a grant program for independent fact-checkers and long-form media creators who prioritize nuance over clicks. She didn't just fight the old system, she seeded the new one, and it spread faster than anyone expected. College campuses began to echo her language. Student government debates started opening with pledges to respect the full sentence. Online creators, exhausted by the toxicity of engagement algorithms, began tagging their work with #sign uncut, a movement Jasmine herself helped launch. Even on Capitol Hill, where cynicism often smothers sincerity, her colleagues began to adopt her tone. In committee hearings, representatives would now pause before interrupting, saying, "Let's let them finish. Let's hear the full sentence." It became more than a catchphrase. It became a signal that the speaker understood something deeper about the power of narrative and the danger of distortion. Jasmine's own team underwent a transformation too. Her communication staff stopped releasing press statements in traditional formats. Instead, they began posting raw transcripts and time-stamped audio directly to public servers, available to constituents, media, and opposition alike. No spin, no clipping, just transparency. And while some criticized the move as naive, the results were undeniable. Trust soared. Even critics began to respect her method. They might not agree with her, but they couldn't accuse her of hiding. And in an era where authenticity was often faked for engagement, Jasmine's was undeniable. But the most powerful shift happened in places the cameras couldn't reach. In small town halls where young black girls raised their hands and said, "I want to speak like Jasmine Crockett." In newsroom pitch meetings where editors paused and asked, "Are we telling this story in full?" In living rooms where parents sat with their children and showed them both clips, the edited one and the full version, and asked, "Do you see the difference?" Jasmine's movement was not loud. It was not flashy, but it was everywhere. A quiet architecture rebuilding trust, one sentence at a time. And still, she stayed grounded. She returned to her district often, not as a celebrity, but as a neighbor. She held listening sessions, not rallies. She asked questions before giving answers. She taught. She learned. She showed up. She never let her national presence become a substitute for local service. When asked how she managed the balance, she smiled and said, "Because I know what it feels like to be unheard. I'll never let anyone near me feel that again." And she meant it. Her movement wasn't built on her name. It was built on her example. That's why it grew. That's why it lasted. Because it wasn't about idolizing Jasmine Crockett. It was about empowering the next person who might be targeted, twisted, or silenced. She gave them a strategy. She gave them language. She gave them proof that truth, if held long enough and spoken clearly enough, will survive the storm. And long after the headlines faded and the outrage industries moved on to their next target, the structure Jasmine built remained. A new standard, a slower kind of justice, one that doesn't go viral but goes deep. And that was exactly what she wanted. Not to be a moment, but to ignite a movement that couldn't be edited out. Time passed, but Jasmine Crockett's voice didn't fade. It echoed, not in a loud, performative way, not in headlines or drama, but in classrooms, courtrooms, auditoriums, and quiet moments of reckoning. Her name stopped trending long ago, but her words never left. They clung to the conscience of a world that had nearly allowed her to be erased. Her story, once nearly reduced to a viral lie, had become a permanent fixture in the global conversation about power, perception, and principle. People still remembered where they were when they saw the full clip for the first time, the way it cracked through their certainty and made them question what else they'd believed without knowing the whole truth. Jasmine hadn't just survived. She had changed the shape of survival. She had redefined what it meant to stand tall after being buried by narrative warfare. And because of that, she lived on. Not as a politician, not even as a public figure, but as a standard, a reference point, a symbol. In media schools, she became required reading. The edited clip and the full version were now side by side in ethics textbooks, shown to students to study the mechanics of manipulation, the speed of distortion, the cost of silence. Professors wrote papers with titles like The Crockett Principle, Truth in an Age of Editing. Her TED Talk was still one of the most viewed of all time. Not because it went viral, but because it became found, again and again. Every time someone needed to remember that truth doesn't disappear, it only waits. But Jasmine never let that legacy turn her to stone. She refused to become a statue. She stayed moving, working, showing up, not because she wanted to hold on to relevance, but because she believed the fight never truly ends. She often said, "The moment we believe we've won, we've already lost sight of who's still losing." So she kept listening, kept traveling, kept speaking, not louder, but clearer. Invitations never stopped. Global summits, human rights tribunals, international press freedom conferences, but she never showed up to be admired. She showed up to ask better questions, to challenge the spaces that invited her to remember the ones that still weren't invited at all. At the United Nations, she spoke about narrative suppression, not as theory, but as memory. She told the story not of her own rise, but of the silence before it, of the calls that stopped coming, of the emails unanswered, of the former colleagues who whispered apologies only after the cameras returned. She didn't name them. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough. She stood on that global stage and reminded the world that erasure doesn't always come with violence. Sometimes it comes with silence. And when she finished, the entire chamber stood, not just in respect, but in reflection. Because they all recognized it. They had seen it. Some had even done it. But Jasmine had outlived it. Back in the United States, her story inspired not just law, but action. Dozens of states introduced full context acts for local media coverage, bills modeled after her federal legislation. Independent journalists built platforms designed entirely on her transparency model, prioritizing full interviews over flashy edits, clarity over virality. These platforms didn't rise because of algorithms. They rose because people were tired of being misled, tired of being manipulated, tired of hearing voices only to discover they'd been filtered through a machine. Jasmine had shown them that another model was possible, one where nuance wasn't weakness, one where a full sentence had more power than any soundbite. In the years that followed, new public figures began rising into the spotlight. Activists, advocates, first-time candidates, and in nearly every profile written about them, one sentence kept appearing. They speak with a Jasmine Crockett clarity. It became a benchmark, an expectation. Not just that you be principled, but that you be measured, strategic, and ready to have your words distorted and still stand behind them. Jasmine didn't just survive media manipulation, she rewired the media's relationship to integrity. And in doing so, she gave permission to a new generation to resist not with noise, but with truth delivered whole. But while the public honored her legacy, Jasmine never lost touch with the pain beneath it. She carried that season of betrayal with her, not as bitterness, but as a reminder of the cost of being misunderstood in a world too impatient to listen. There were days she still replayed the clip, not out of pride, but out of grounding. It kept her close to those who never got their truth back, those who didn't have the chance, the platform, or the timing to survive what she had. She carried them with her. Every speech, every interview, every policy she fought for, she saw them in it. Not just herself, that was the heart of her legacy. She didn't stand for Jasmine. She stood for everyone who'd ever been reduced to a misquote and left to burn in its wake. Years after the scandal, she returned to the very studio where it all began. Not for an interview, for a panel. The show had been restructured, rebranded, almost unrecognizable. But the walls were the same. And when she walked in, the crew paused. Some looked away, some nodded respectfully. The host, a younger woman now trained in full context ethics, educated by the very textbooks that bore Jasmine's name, introduced her not as a guest, but as a reason this show even exists in its current form. Jasmine smiled, nodded, sat. And when she spoke, the room didn't just listen. It waited. For every word, every pause, every full sentence. And that was her revolution. Not in policy, not in applause, but in patience restored. Because the world hadn't just remembered what she said. It remembered how long it took to hear it. And as the world slowly began to adjust to hearing full truths again, Jasmine's story stopped being just a case study in survival. It became a lesson in humanity that couldn't be ignored. What Jasmine Crockett endured was never just about politics, power, or the media. It was about something far more fragile and far more dangerous to lose: the integrity of a person's voice. In a world obsessed with speed and spectacle, we forget how much damage can be done in seconds, how a life's worth of purpose can be twisted into a weapon by one clip, one cut, one convenient lie. Jasmine's story was a mirror held up to our collective impatience, a reminder that justice isn't loud, and truth rarely goes viral without scars. She faced the kind of erasure that doesn't come with violence, but with design, the slow, calculated kind that robs you not just of your image, but of your intention. And yet she didn't collapse. She didn't become bitter. She didn't feed the cycle with more rage. She stood still, and in doing so, she exposed something most of us try to deny: that we are far too quick to believe what's been edited for us, and far too slow to wait for the truth to speak for itself. The humanitarian lesson here wasn't written in legislation or carved into the walls of some global summit. It was found in the silence between attacks, in the way Jasmine refused to dehumanize even those who sought to erase her, in the restraint it took to not answer every fire with fire, but instead to build a platform strong enough that the fire collapsed under its own weight. She taught us that justice without vengeance is possible, and more than that, powerful. She reminded us that you don't need to destroy your enemies to win. Sometimes all you need to do is outlast the lie with patience, with clarity, and with unwavering truth. The story could have ended in bitterness, but it didn't. Because Jasmine knew that the most radical form of resistance isn't shouting louder. It's being unshakably right and refusing to disappear. But perhaps the most painful truth buried in this story is one we rarely talk about: that silence, when it's forced, is violence. Jasmine wasn't just misquoted. She was deliberately muted. They tried to edit her into someone unrecognizable, not just to the world, but to herself. And it's a reminder to all of us that when we rush to judge, when we share the clip before we check the context, we're not just clicking, we're participating in that muting. The screen between us and the story doesn't absolve us of responsibility. Jasmine's experience showed us how easily a reputation can be shredded by a sentence, and how slowly it must be rebuilt word by word, under scrutiny, under doubt, under pressure. The next time we see a headline, a clip, a quote meant to spark rage, we owe it to her, to all who've been silenced, to stop, to pause, to ask, what's missing here? Because the moment we stop asking that question is the moment we become part of the machine that almost erased her. In the end, Jasmine Crockett's greatest legacy wasn't her recovery, it was her refusal to play by the rules of retaliation. She broke the pattern. She showed that you can fight back without becoming what attacked you, that you can hold your head high in a room full of people who once doubted you, not out of pride, but out of principle. Her story wasn't just one woman's comeback. It was a warning to those who weaponize narratives and an invitation to those who consume them. A call to slow down, to listen longer, to remember that behind every clip is a beating heart, a full life, and a voice that deserves more than 15 seconds of judgment. Jasmine reminded us that truth doesn't always arrive on schedule, but when it does, it demands to be heard completely. And if we're willing, really willing, to listen past the noise, we might just hear ourselves in it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Over 25 million people watched as Jasmine Crockett looked Pam Bondi straight in the eye. and said what no one else in that courtroom dared to say. It wasn't just a debate, it was a confrontation about racial bias, judicial double standards, and the dangerous politicization of justice. Her words shook the entire nation and exposed a system that protects the powerful and punishes those who are never heard. So why did it take one woman's truth to bring it all crashing down? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber was electric, thick with tension, expectation, and quiet calculation. Outside the Capitol, reporters packed the steps. Inside, marble columns loomed over the packed gallery like silent sentinels. Every major network had gone live. Headlines scrolled beneath the screen. Live, congressional hearing on the politicization of the U.S. justice system. Viewers from both ends of the political spectrum tuned in, hungry for fireworks, and they were about to get them. At the witness table sat two women who were never meant to agree. To the left, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her papers with deliberate calm. Her navy suit was crisp, but it was her stillness that demanded attention, like a storm gathering behind glass. A former public defender turned legislator, Crockett was known for her firebrand speeches and her refusal to play by the script. She had walked into this chamber carrying more than statistics. She carried the weight of every wrongfully accused, every overlooked community, every courtroom where the scales of justice were tilted by race, money, or power. To the right sat Pam Bondi, radiating poise like it was perfume. Her reputation preceded her. Former Florida Attorney General, political pit bull, a familiar face to those who still watch the Trump impeachment reruns for sport. In her tailored ivory jacket and signature blowout, she looked like the embodiment of elite legal orthodoxy. Her expression was measured, her smile thin. She knew how to hold a camera's gaze and how to strike with precision when it counted. They didn't speak. Not yet. But in that long, loaded pause before the hearing officially opened, it was already clear. This wasn't going to be a policy discussion. It was going to be war. And just as the silence seemed to stretch too long, Bondi struck, not with volume, but with venom, her words sliding into the record like a dagger dressed in decorum. "Let's be absolutely clear," she began, her voice smooth and steady, but with a chill that cut through the air. "This hearing isn't about reform. It's about control. Who gets to bend the rules and who gets to pretend they're fixing them?" She didn't turn her head, didn't need to. Her eyes were already locked, unwavering, on Crockett. "We've reached a point where justice is no longer blind. It's selective, and it's being driven by a political agenda disguised as empathy." She lifted a folder from the desk, held it just high enough for the cameras to catch, and flipped it open like revealing a case file in court. "Let me give you one example. Travis County, Texas. A case involving a repeat violent offender, aggravated assault, history of domestic violence. The prosecution had the tools to put him away, but instead they offered a plea deal. Light sentence, no jail time." She let that sink in, slowly, cruelly. The district attorney behind that decision? Someone this congresswoman publicly and repeatedly supported. Fundraisers, endorsements, public statements praising her courage to reimagine justice. Bondi's voice was measured, but her words hit with the precision of a sniper shot. "Let's reimagine that justice through the eyes of the victim, the woman who was attacked. Let's ask her if political courage matters more than consequences." She finally turned now, head tilted slightly, eyes narrowed with practiced judgment. "Congresswoman Crockett, how many more violent men have to walk free in the name of compassion before we call this what it is? Irresponsible, reckless, and yes, dangerous." She placed the folder down slowly, like a gavel of her own. "I understand where you come from, I do," she said with a patronizing softness that stung more than any raised voice. "But courtroom emotion doesn't equal courtroom justice. The law's not supposed to feel, it is supposed to work. And right now, under policies you celebrate, it's failing the very people it claims to protect." Bondi's voice dropped just slightly, like a final twist of the knife. "This isn't activism, it's abandonment. And when lawmakers defend bad prosecutors just because they share a hashtag or a headline, they are choosing politics over people, over victims. She leaned back in her chair, unbothered, self-satisfied. And for a moment, the room felt like it had tilted just slightly toward her. She adjusted her mic with one deliberate finger, as if the weight of Bondi's words hadn't even grazed her. Then she leaned in, not with aggression, but with the eerie stillness of someone who'd heard worse in rooms where no cameras ever rolled. Her voice came low and measured, but each word cracked through the air like slow thunder. "That's not emotion, Ms. Bondi," she said, her gaze locked and unshakable. "That's reality. That's the sound of what it looks like when the people I represent are drowning in a system designed to ignore them." She held the silence a second longer, letting it settle like smoke in a courtroom after a verdict. "You say justice is blind, but where I come from, it sees color, it sees class, and it sees campaign donations, especially the kind you used to cash." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Crockett didn't look away. "Where I come from, people don't get deals. They get discarded. And if you think standing up for those people is reckless, then maybe you've spent too much time protecting power and not enough time confronting it." She sat back slowly, but her presence filled the space like fire spreading in slow motion. "You talk about law like it's some sacred thing," she continued, still calm, still terrifyingly clear. "But the law isn't sacred if it only works for people who can afford it. If a rich man can buy silence, buy leniency, buy a clean record, but a black kid in Oak Cliff goes to jail for a joint, don't you dare call that justice." Her voice didn't rise, but her intensity doubled with every syllable. "The real danger isn't compassion, it's complacency. It's people in power pretending the system works just fine, because it works for them." And now her words weren't just directed at Bondi. They were aimed at every camera, every viewer, every person who had ever believed that fairness was automatic. "You want to know the truth? I didn't come here to make you comfortable. I came here to remind you that justice, real justice, isn't quiet, and it sure as hell isn't for sale." The weight of Crockett's words was still hanging in the air when she made her next move. Not with fury, but with surgical precision, cutting into the silence like a scalpel aimed straight at the heart of Bondi's record. "I think it's time we stop pretending that power always wears a badge or holds a gavel," Crockett said, her voice steady but charged with restrained fire. "Sometimes power wears a smile and signs checks in quiet rooms, behind closed doors with the blinds drawn." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her calm only made the words feel heavier, like the quiet part of a storm that flattens everything in its path. "And since we're here talking about justice, let's not leave your chapter out, Ms. Bondi." She turned slightly in her seat, enough for the cameras to catch her expression, composed but deadly serious. "Florida, 2013. A fraud investigation into Trump University lands on your desk. Thousands of everyday Americans, janitors, retirees, single parents, file complaints. They say they were promised financial freedom, mentorship, a future. What they got: empty seminar rooms and 3-ring binders full of recycled advice they could have Googled for free." She let that hang for a beat. No theatrics, just the weight of hard truth. "And right as your office considered legal action against that operation," she continued, her tone colder now, razor sharp, "a check arrives. Not just any check. A $25,000 donation from the Trump Foundation to your political committee. That's not rumor, that's public record." Her fingers tapped the desk once, quiet, deliberate. Then, like clockwork, the case disappears, dropped, buried, gone. The air in the room grew still again, like everyone had forgotten how to breathe. "And somehow you want to come in here and lecture me about ethical decay? About prosecutors being compromised by public pressure?" She leaned in now, but not for show. She was locking eyes with the very structure of hypocrisy. That wasn't justice. That wasn't discretion. That was convenience. Bought and paid for. Bondi's lips tightened, but no words came. Crockett didn't pause. She was in complete control. Slow, focused, relentless. "What did you say earlier? That the law shouldn't feel, it should function?" she asked, repeating Bondi's earlier line. Well, it functions just fine for Trump University. It protected them. It silenced victims. It kept the powerful untouched and the powerless unpaid. So when you stand there behind a podium or in front of a camera and pretend that this system doesn't bend to wealth and influence, you're not defending justice. You're defending the lie that you helped write. Now her voice softened, but somehow it struck harder. I've seen what happens to people who can't afford a lawyer, let alone a donation. They don't get their cases dropped. They get a lifetime record. They lose jobs. They lose custody. They lose hope. And while you were accepting checks, I was holding hands with mothers whose sons were locked up for less than a broken promise. Her hands were flat on the desk now, firm, unmoving. So let's not pretend this is a courtroom. This is a mirror. And the truth staring back at you, Ms. Bondi, isn't political. It's personal. It's about the kind of justice you chose to protect and the kind of people you chose to leave behind. No applause, no reaction, just the thunderous quiet of a room that knew something irreversible had just been said. But Bondi, cornered and visibly rattled, didn't retreat. Instead, she pivoted hard, seizing the moment to paint herself as the last line of defense against what she called a rising tide of lawlessness. "Let's stop pretending," Bondi said, her voice louder now, her tone sharper, like she was cutting through a crowd rather than addressing a colleague. "You don't want reform, you want disorder." She wasn't speaking to just Crockett anymore. She was performing, speaking to the audience, watching from home, to the political base that cheered every word like gospel. "You've made a career out of defending a system that tells officers to stand down while streets burn. You support DAs who won't prosecute. You push policies that reward criminals with second chances and punish the people who wear a badge." She leaned forward, gripping the edges of the desk. "You say justice, but what you mean is sympathy for people who break the law, and that makes you dangerous." Her voice dropped slightly, dramatic pause and all. "Because when law and order crumbles, the only ones who suffer are the people who don't have the luxury to hide behind gated communities or armed security." She straightened her back. "I believe in fairness, but I also believe in law. And you believe in feelings." The room went silent again, but this time the tension didn't crackle. It burned. Slowly, deliberately, Crockett sat up straighter, her eyes fixed on Bondi with the focus of someone who had waited her whole life for a moment like this. "You want to talk about danger?" she said, her voice low, her words like stones dropped into deep water, each one sending ripples. "Danger is when a black teenager is pulled over for a busted taillight and ends up dead. Danger is when a mother calls the police during a mental health crisis and loses her son. Danger is when poor communities are policed like war zones, while wealthy neighborhoods get warning letters and second chances." She paused, not for effect, but to let the truth breathe. "You say I stand against law enforcement. No, I stand against abuse. I stand against silence. I stand against a system that has been allowed to ignore the pain of people who look like me for generations." Then came the pivot, smooth, precise, devastating. "You want to know what real lawlessness looks like?" she continued, voice unwavering. "It's when billionaires break laws with impunity because their lawyers play golf with judges. It's when corporations pollute black and brown neighborhoods and nobody ever gets charged. It's when politicians like you, who once held the power to prosecute, look the other way when the man writing checks to your campaign is the one being investigated." She leaned in now, her voice cold as winter steel. "That's not law. That's privilege with a badge. And you want to talk to me about accountability?" Her tone darkened, not with anger, but with lived experience. "I've sat with mothers whose sons were sentenced to decades for stealing groceries. I've stood beside families begging for a fair trial while prosecutors joked in the hallway." Her hands were flat on the table, firm. "So no, I won't apologize for demanding better. And I won't sit here while you try to blame broken communities for the cracks you helped carve into this system." Stillness again. Dense, heavy, undeniable. She looked Bondi in the eyes, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous to people like her. Truth without fear. "You don't get to call me dangerous just because I don't smile while I watch injustice happen. You don't get to wrap silence in a uniform and call it safety. And you sure as hell don't get to lecture me on law when the law has been weaponized against people like me since before I was born." She sat back, still calm, still centered. You call it justice. I call it selective survival. And this time, even the cameras didn't dare cut away. But the battle didn't end in that chamber. It only changed arenas, and this time, the battleground was the internet, where perception could crown a hero or bury a career in a matter of hours. Within 15 minutes of the hearing ending, a junior producer at the network clipped the moment and uploaded it to the show's official account. No context, no back and forth. Just one searing segment. Crockett, eyes locked, voice like steel, saying, "That's not law. That's privilege with a badge." The title was provocative. Watch Rep. Crockett shuts down Pam Bondi in stunning exchange. And that was all it needed. The clip exploded across Twitter, then Instagram, then TikTok. In less than an hour, it hit 1 million views. But with the views came the divide. Instant, vicious, and relentless. On the far right, the attacks came fast and hard. Pundits labeled Crockett unprofessional, hyper-emotional, and a radical leftist masquerading as a lawmaker. Conservative influencers accused her of disrespecting law enforcement and turning Congress into a daytime talk show. Headlines from right-wing blogs screamed, "Crockett melts down on national TV." She was called a disgrace in a blazer, a walking identity politics campaign, and worse. They slowed the video, pausing on her hand gestures, her facial expressions, twisting them into GIFs and memes meant to belittle. One graphic, shared by a political action group, featured her image with the words, "Would you trust this woman with your safety?" Below it, 60,000 angry shares, 15,000 comments, most of them venomous. But on the left, it was a different storm entirely, one of fire and celebration. Progressive outlets praised her as a voice the system fears because it can't buy her. TikTok users layered her audio over footage of courtrooms, protests, and marches. Women of color, especially, gravitated to her tone, not just the content, but the composure. "This isn't rage," one post read. "This is resistance refined." Hashtags like Crockett Truth and "She Said It For Us" trended within hours. Educators clipped her quotes for classroom discussion. Political organizers used the moment to fundraise for criminal justice reform. People weren't just praising her. They were projecting onto her, drawing strength from her presence. Comments poured in. "You reminded me why I went to law school. You spoke for my brother who can't. That's how you bring facts to a fight." But it wasn't all uplifting. Crockett's team quietly turned off comments on several platforms. Not out of weakness, but because the backlash was starting to tip into threats. Her office line rang nonstop. Some messages were encouraging, others were chilling. A few were flat out dangerous. She had faced pushback before, but never like this. Not this fast, not this wide, not this personal. And still the clip kept circulating, frame by frame, sentence by sentence. It was dissected on cable news. It was debated on morning radio. It was transcribed, captioned, remixed, subtitled in 6 languages. Her face became a symbol of defiance, of division, of what it means to speak truth on live television and live through the fallout after. For every person who cheered her courage, there was another who called it a tantrum in heels. That was the price of clarity in a country addicted to noise. And yet she hadn't shouted. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't even interrupted. She had simply told the truth, and the internet decided that was enough to start a war. And just when it seemed the storm might pass, a voice from the old guard cut through the noise. One that didn't yell, didn't trend, but carried the gravity of someone who had once worn the robe of final judgment. The video was quiet, no dramatic music, no split screens, just a single camera centered on the face of retired federal judge Alan Kessler, a man who had presided over some of the most complex civil rights cases of the past 3 decades. He sat at a simple wooden desk, surrounded by shelves stacked with worn legal volumes, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting deep shadows across his hands. Hands that once signed orders that changed lives. His voice, when it came, was soft but deliberate, the way judges speak when they're not trying to impress, only to be understood. "I've watched the full exchange between Representative Crockett and former Attorney General Bondi 3 times, he began. not looking at notes, but into the camera. And I want to say this plainly. This clip, this moment, isn't just political theater. It's a masterclass in what legal tension looks like in a divided nation. He paused, breathing slowly, almost like he was choosing every word as if it were going into court record. This should be required viewing in every first-year constitutional law class. Not because it was polite, not because it reached resolution, but because it exposed the exact fault line we've been ignoring for too long. The difference between what the law says and who it actually protects. He leaned slightly forward, his fingers touching in a steeple. What made it powerful wasn't the heat, it was the control. Crockett didn't shout, she didn't flinch, she didn't even interrupt. She told the truth clearly, calmly, and without apology. And what did she get in return? Smirks, accusations, a wave of backlash for daring to speak with the authority of someone who's lived what others only quote from footnotes. The video cut to a closer frame, uncomfortably intimate. Judge Kessler didn't blink. "This moment matter," he said firmly, "because it shows what happens when a black woman, fully qualified and unshaken, refuses to let the system talk over her. It shows how quickly strength is miscast as aggression and clarity is repackaged as emotion. I've sat in courtrooms where the same words spoken by a man in a Navy suit would be called brilliant advocacy. But when it comes from a woman who looks like Reppers Crockett, suddenly it's divisive. Suddenly it's a problem." He exhaled and rested both hands flat on the table. "This is not a debate clip. This is a mirror, and the legal profession needs to look hard and long at what it reflects about us." His last words didn't rise in volume, but in weight. "We teach law students how to argue," he said. "We should also teach them how to listen. Because if you watched that hearing and came away thinking Crockett was the problem, then you're not ready for the courtroom, and you're certainly not ready to serve justice." Then without a sign-off, he leaned back and let the camera fade to black. By the end of the day, that 2-minute video was being shared not just on political feeds, but in law school forums, ethics newsletters, and faculty emails across the country. Not because it was loud, but because someone who had spent a lifetime in silence finally said what the system itself had been too afraid to admit. But as the public firestorm raged online, it began to ignite consequences in the real world. Ones measured not in likes or headlines, but in threats, cancellations, and the silent suffocation of pressure closing in from every direction. For Crockett, the wave of digital attention didn't end with applause. It came with menace. The first threats were vague, cowardly messages from untraceable accounts filled with slurs and veiled warnings. But within 48 hours, they escalated. Someone sent a voicemail describing the layout of her district office, what time the lights went off, how many exits there were. Another email included a photo of her standing in line at a grocery store 2 days earlier. One message simply read, "You made yourself a target." Her staff tried to stay calm, but the tone inside the office shifted overnight. From focused to guarded, from passionate to paranoid. Windows were covered, locks were changed, panic buttons were issued, and through it all, Crockett kept walking into the building like nothing had changed. But everything had. She now had armed security on rotation. Her personal calendar was scrubbed of public locations. Even her route to the Capitol was altered daily. She didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't pause. But inside, she understood what this really meant. The moment she chose to speak the truth on national television, someone else decided she no longer deserved to feel safe. And yet she still showed up. Across the aisle, both literally and politically, Pam Bondi faced a different storm. Her punishment wasn't loud, but it was precise. That weekend, she was scheduled to headline a major conservative leadership conference in Palm Beach, a speaking slot she had booked months in advance. Without warning, her name was removed from the program. Organizers didn't even call. Her assistant found out from a journalist. When she pressed for answers, the response was diplomatic but clear. "We've decided to take the program in a different direction." Behind closed doors, however, donors were furious. Some had already pulled funding. Others threatened to walk. They saw Bondi's televised performance not as strength, but as recklessness. "She let a personal grudge derail the party message," one strategist said anonymously. Another, blunter, "She lost to a Democrat on camera. That's not what we pay for." Invitations disappeared. Her media requests were ghosted. The networks that once called weekly stopped returning calls. Her inbox, usually buzzing, went still. The silence was louder than the shouts Crockett faced. And here, under the weight of scrutiny, their differences became unmistakable. Bondi began to retreat, canceling interviews, skipping panels, refusing follow-up statements. She wasn't destroyed, but she was diminished. For the first time in years, she was no longer the face they wanted beside the podium. Crockett, on the other hand, kept rising. Bruised, maybe. Watched, absolutely, but rising. Her team didn't shrink. They closed ranks. They didn't cancel appearances. They adjusted routes. While Bondi disappeared into quiet damage control, Crockett stood in bulletproof glass hallways and answered questions with a fire that hadn't dimmed. Not because she wanted to prove anything, but because she understood that power is tested most when it's under threat, and she refused to blink first. In a week filled with headlines, outrage, and fear, 2 women were tested. Only one kept walking forward. But even in the heart of this chaos, Crockett never lost sight of why she spoke the way she did. Because she'd already seen firsthand what silence costs in a courtroom built to swallow the innocent. His name was Darnell Whitaker, and he was already halfway forgotten by the system when Jasmine first read his case file. 34 years old, father, mechanic, never had so much as a parking ticket. But now he was facing 5 years in prison for second-degree assault. The police report said he had escalated a fight outside a downtown bar. No weapon, no prior. Just a name on a file and skin the courtroom wouldn't forget. The prosecutor never looked him in the eye. The judge barely concealed his impatience. The evidence? Weak. A single witness with blurry memory. No security footage had been submitted, but none of that seemed to matter. The gears of the machine had already turned. The arrest had been made. The charge had been filed. Now it was time to process the defendant. Quietly, quickly, permanently. Jasmine remembered sitting across from Darnell in that holding cell. His hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He had missed his daughter's birthday. His rent had lapsed. His employer stopped answering his calls. "I didn't touch that man," he whispered. "I swear to God I didn't." She believed him, not just because of the way he said it, but because of the way the system treated him, like he was already a ghost, like they had no expectation of him walking out. Just another case to close, another body to move through the pipeline. But Jasmine wasn't built for closing cases. She was built for cracking them open. She went back through every scrap of evidence the state had handed over. She noticed the timestamp on the body cam footage, missing 23 minutes. She filed a motion. They fought her. She pushed again. Eventually, they released an overlooked CD from a nearby deli security camera. Grainy, black and white, no sound. But there it was. Darnell, backing away from the argument, hands raised, never throwing a punch. The so-called victim? Clearly the aggressor. In the courtroom, when she played that footage, even the jury leaned forward. The prosecutor tried to pivot, tried to shift the timeline. But the image didn't lie. It said what Darnell couldn't afford to scream, "I didn't do this." When the verdict came, not guilty, Darnell didn't celebrate. He just sat there, shoulders slumped, hands in his lap, tears falling without motion. Jasmine didn't speak. She let the silence stretch. She watched him stand, step out from behind the defense table, and leave that courtroom with the kind of dignity no one in the system had ever offered him. No press, no apology, just freedom. That night back in her apartment, Jasmine stared at the photo of Darnell's daughter he'd given her. On the back he had scribbled in shaky pen, "Thank you for believing me." And that was the moment it hit her. Not just the weight of the case, but the shape of the system. The law had worked against him until someone forced it to see him. It wasn't a fluke, it was a pattern. And that courtroom hadn't failed. It had done exactly what it was designed to do, until someone made it stop. From that day on, Crockett knew she wasn't just arguing cases. She was pushing against something much heavier than a verdict. She was dragging the truth uphill through a system built to forget. And she vowed right then and there that she would never sit silently while the law erased people like Darnell again. While Crockett's resolve grew stronger under pressure, Far from the cameras and the noise, Pam Bondi found herself confronting a different kind of silence. The kind that doesn't shout but slowly, methodically, starts to unravel you from the inside. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't calm, it accuses. Bondi sat in the same chair she always did, a white leather armchair in her study, a glass of untouched Chardonnay on the side table, and her laptop glowing against the shadows. She had watched the clip of the hearing twice already, then a third time in full, this time with the sound just a little lower, like somehow it would feel softer if it didn't echo so loudly through the room. She knew every line she delivered. She had practiced them, polished them. She'd worn confidence like a tailored suit. But now, watching it all back, the edges felt jagged. Her voice didn't sound strong. It sounded rehearsed. And when Jasmine Crockett responded, not with anger but with surgical calm, Pam felt a twinge in her stomach she hadn't expected. Not shame, not yet, but something that felt dangerously close. She paused the video and just stared at the frozen frame. Her own face, mid-sentence, caught between calculation and pride. She didn't like the way she looked, not because of her hair or her expression, but because she couldn't remember why she'd said what she said. Was it to prove a point, or was it to score one? The difference used to matter to her. Now she wasn't so sure. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she scrubbed back to the moment where Crockett said, "You didn't walk away from that case because of principle. You walked away with political capital." The line hit harder this time. It wasn't about Trump. It wasn't even about the university scandal. It was about something more insidious, the possibility that somewhere along the way, Pam Bondi had stopped serving justice and started serving herself. She leaned back in the chair, suddenly aware of how heavy the room felt. The walls that once held diplomas and framed press clippings now felt like mirrors. Every case she hadn't touched, every time she'd chosen silence over scrutiny, the political allies she'd protected, the moments she'd told herself, that's just how the game is played. She had played it well, rose fast, spoke sharp, made headlines, but now there were no cameras, no crowd, just her own voice, and a single question that kept circling in her mind like a low drone she couldn't shut off. Have I spent my entire career defending the law or defending power? She thought of the conference she was quietly dropped from, the calls that didn't come this week, the allies who hadn't replied, and yet what haunted her most wasn't being excluded. It was how easily they had replaced her. Her image had been built on control, precision, discipline. But now that image was cracked, and what lay beneath wasn't a villain or a victim, just a woman who couldn't quite remember when she stopped fighting for people and started fighting for position. She pressed play again. Let the clip roll. This time she didn't pause it. She just watched and listened to Crockett's voice, to her own, and to the silence in between, because that silence said everything she hadn't been ready to hear. And after the media frenzy had cooled and the dust had barely settled, fate placed them under the same roof once more. This time not in a courtroom or hearing, but on a national stage where the audience expected fireworks and instead received something far more unsettling. The ballroom at the Hyatt in D.C. was packed beyond capacity. Rows of metal chairs filled the space wall to wall. Every seat was occupied, every standing space filled shoulder to shoulder. The room pulsed with anticipation, a quiet thrum that grew louder with every second the panel remained seated in silence. The air smelled faintly of coffee, polished wood, and nerves. Students clutched notebooks. Activists adjusted their phones on tripods. Behind the podium, a modest sign read, "National Summit on Judicial Reform, Equity, Accountability, Change." But no one was here for the tagline. They were here for the two women sitting on opposite ends of the stage, Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett, each separated by 3 nameplates and a gulf of ideology. Everyone remembered what had happened during the televised hearing weeks ago. Everyone knew this wasn't just a panel, it was a powder keg. And someone, everyone believed, was going to light the fuse. The moderator welcomed them politely, thanked them for their time, introduced each panelist with the formality of someone hoping to keep control. Bondi spoke first, Measured, articulate, deliberate. Her words were all structure and no soul, the kind of legalese that fills time without drawing heat. She kept her eyes forward, avoided glancing in Crockett's direction, and spoke in terms of judicial integrity and respect for process. Her tone was steady, her posture perfect, but the room didn't lean in. When the mic passed to Crockett, you could feel the shift. It wasn't dramatic, it was visceral, a kind of collective breath hold, like the audience knew something important was about to happen, even if they didn't know what it was yet. She didn't shuffle her notes, didn't posture, just looked slowly across the room, then straight into the light, as if she wasn't speaking to the audience in front of her, but to something much larger outside the walls. She took the mic and said only one thing. "Justice has no color," she began, her voice low and unwavering, "but the people making decisions keep seeing only color and their own interests." That was it. 10 seconds, no flourish, no anger, just truth, placed quietly in the center of the room like a weight no one knew how to carry. And for a moment, it felt like time stopped. No clapping, no whispering, no pivot from the moderator. Just silence, raw and unbearable. The kind of silence that comes when a truth has been spoken that everyone recognizes, but no one wants to answer for. Someone in the back cleared their throat and immediately regretted it. A camera clicked. Bondi didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes dropped. Not down in shame, but in calculation, like she was processing how many people had just heard something she couldn't refute. The moderator shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his cards, clearly unsure whether to speak or simply move on. But Crockett didn't fill the silence. She let it linger. She understood something that moment demanded, that power doesn't always come from what you say. It comes from knowing when to stop talking. Her words didn't need elaboration. They needed oxygen. They needed to be felt. And that's exactly what happened. The room felt smaller. The conversation felt bigger. People didn't just hear her, they absorbed her. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew what she had said was not an opinion. It was an observation. And no amount of policy language or political spin could bury it. She didn't lean back in triumph. She didn't smile. She just passed the mic quietly to the next speaker and folded her hands, unbothered, unapologetic, unmoved. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do on a stage built for confrontation is tell the truth and let everyone else sit in it. The echo of her words still lingered in the minds of everyone who had heard them. But behind closed doors, those words were doing something more dangerous. They were shifting power, and for the first time, the system was forced to reckon with her presence. The phone rang before the sun reached the windows. The screen flashed with an unfamiliar DC number, and for a split second, Jasmine Crockett thought it might be another threat, another reminder of what truth costs. But the voice on the line wasn't sharp or hostile. It was careful, measured. A staffer from the White House counsel's office, speaking with the kind of tone reserved for moments that rewrite things. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "you've been selected as one of 7 appointees to the new Federal Commission on Judicial Reform." She didn't answer right away, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood too well. Her mind flashed through 1,000 memories, nights spent poring over case files as a public defender, speaking into microphones that cut her off mid-sentence, walking into hearings where she was treated like a disruptor instead of a policymaker. And now they were asking her to join the table that decides how justice in America should evolve. She thanked him with a voice steady as stone, hung up, and sat in silence. Outside her window, DC moved like it always had. Sirens in the distance, the faint clatter of garbage trucks, the slow pulse of a city always watching, always measuring. But something had changed. She wasn't just reacting to injustice anymore. She was being asked to redesign the architecture of it, to walk into the belly of a system that had tried to erase her voice again and again, and leave her fingerprints on its walls. The same halls that once ignored her now had her name etched into policy briefings and internal memos, and she knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't flattery, it wasn't generosity, it was necessity. Her presence had become undeniable. But she also knew what came next wouldn't be ceremony. It would be friction. She would be entering rooms where compromise was currency, and her truth would make some of the most powerful people in the country uncomfortable. They'd call her aggressive, emotional, relentless, and they'd be right. Because Crockett hadn't come this far to be polite. She didn't claw her way into these halls so she could whisper. She came to be heard, and now they'd have to listen. And while Crockett was stepping deeper into the fire, invited to reshape the very system that once tried to silence her, Bondi was quietly backing away from the spotlight she had once commanded, without question. For almost a decade, Pam Bondi had lived in the glow of cameras. It wasn't just a job. It was rhythm, identity, muscle memory. She knew which side was her better angle. She could slip into a studio with a soundbite ready and deliver it with polished certainty. Her voice had been quoted in headlines. Her clips had gone viral. Her words, once delivered with clinical precision, had shaped talking points across the political right. But now everything felt off. The phones still rang, but fewer calls came from networks. More of them were from assistants and interns instead of senior producers. The tone had changed. Not hostile, just hesitant. And Bondi, for all her experience, could feel the shift like a tremor under the floorboards. She wasn't the headline anymore. She was the risk. It started small. She canceled a morning panel at a think tank in Miami, citing travel complications. Then came a Fox segment, once her turf, quietly declined. When a live stream roundtable on judicial integrity reached out, her office responded with a polite but firm, "Ms. Bondi is focusing on private matters at this time." In truth, she wasn't traveling. She wasn't sick. She wasn't out of reach. She was sitting in her house, curtains half drawn, television off, phone face down on the table. The same woman who once stepped onto sets with a grin and a folder full of prepared talking points was now avoiding mirrors and skipping press briefings entirely. She wasn't hiding. She was processing. The Crockett moment hadn't just gone viral. It had carved something open inside her. Not humiliation, not even guilt. Something quieter, something she didn't have language for. She had always seen herself as a fighter for order, for strength, for tradition. But now she kept asking herself, whose order? Whose strength? The line she had once confidently drawn between justice and chaos was now blurred. And the more she watched the footage back, the more she saw not a debate, but a reckoning she hadn't been ready for. She didn't talk about it, not to colleagues, not to friends. When they texted her, she gave one-word answers. When they asked if she was doing okay, she sent a thumbs-up emoji. She wasn't afraid of speaking again. She was afraid of being heard and people not believing her anymore. That was new and terrifying. Because once you've been a voice of a movement, losing the room isn't just silence, it's erasure. So she stayed off air, declined interviews, turned down op-ed requests. Some assumed she was regrouping, some said it was strategic retreat, but the truth was simpler and sadder. She didn't know what to say anymore that wouldn't sound rehearsed. She didn't trust her instincts. And without the certainty she'd built her entire public identity on, Bondi was left alone with a question more powerful than any headline. Was it all about the law, or had it always been about the stage? And in that silence, intentional, prolonged, and heavy, she still hadn't found the answer. And as Bondi faded from the spotlight and Crockett stepped fully into hers, the internet, restless, relentless, and watching everything, began to define what had just unfolded in language as sharp as the moment itself. The phrase didn't come from a news anchor or a campaign strategist. It came from a tweet, just 12 words, posted by a civil rights attorney in Atlanta. This wasn't a debate. It was the final battle between bias and truth. At first, it hovered beneath the noise. Then someone screenshotted it. Then someone turned it into a caption. Within hours, it was trending. Bias vs. truth started appearing under clips of the exchange. TikTokers overlaid the quote on slow-motion edits of Crockett's calm stare, her words echoing like a war drum beneath every frame. Justice has no color. Comment threads exploded. People weren't just commenting, they were confessing. "I've never felt seen by a politician until this," wrote a woman from Detroit. "That moment was every black courtroom whisper we've never been allowed to speak out loud," said another. But it wasn't just applause, it was clarity. For years, people had watched politics like it was theater. This moment felt like testimony. There were no gimmicks, no yelling, just one woman stating a truth so raw, it stripped the room of its usual armor. Every frame of that video, the smirk on Bondi's face, the silence that followed Crockett's line, the shift in body language across the panel, was now being slowed down, dissected, and replayed not as drama, but as documentation. Influencers called it a masterclass in restraint. Legal scholars called it precedent in tone. Mothers called it the moment their daughters understood the power of composure. A retired judge called it a turning point. Some media outlets tried to spin it back, called Crockett calculated, performative, overhyped. But their words rang hollow in comparison to the footage. People had seen it. They'd heard the breath between Crockett's sentences, the pause before she dropped truth like iron into a room, expecting more noise than substance. And in that silence, they recognized something too rare in public life: the sound of someone telling the truth without asking for permission. It wasn't just a clash of two women, it was the collision of two systems, one built to maintain power through polish and performance, and the other forged in the fires of lived experience, pain, and absolute refusal to stay quiet. The internet didn't exaggerate when it named it the final battle between bias and truth. If anything, it said what institutions wouldn't. That moment wasn't about who won a debate, it was about who refused to be erased and what happens when the world finally sees it. The video didn't vanish like most political moments do. It didn't rise, spike, and fade. It stuck. Not because it was explosive, but because it was true. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It didn't come wrapped in clever sound bites or flashy edits. It came from a woman sitting at a table, speaking one sentence that punched a hole straight through the room, and the internet knew it had witnessed something different. By the third day, the clip had crossed 10 million views, but that number didn't tell the whole story. It wasn't just the views, it was the velocity, how fast it spread, how many people weren't just watching, but sharing it like gospel. Hashtags like "One on our BSV's Truth" in Crockett Unfiltered trended in different time zones. It started on Twitter, but within hours it was everywhere. Facebook Reels, TikTok loops, LinkedIn forums, even forwarded WhatsApp videos from uncles who didn't follow politics. And it wasn't being shared for outrage, it was being shared for recognition. People weren't just watching Jasmine Crockett speak. They were seeing themselves in her composure, her restraint, her refusal to flinch under the weight of condescension. She had stared directly into a legacy of institutional bias and answered not with anger, but with precision. And the silence that followed her line: "Justice has no color, but the people making decisions keep seeing only color, and their own interests," had become something sacred. It was more than a pause. It was an indictment, and the world heard it. Teachers began using it in civics lessons. Churches wove it into sermons. Debate coaches asked students not just what she said, but how she said it. Podcasts broke down her tone, her body language, the psychology of power and poise. Media experts called it a case study in presence. College professors called it a master class in controlled authority. But for the people watching from kitchen counters, prison bunks, front porches, and grocery store break rooms, it was something else entirely. It was proof. Proof that you didn't have to shout to be heard. Proof that truth, when delivered without apology, could still tear down the room. A retired judge from North Carolina posted a video to LinkedIn. He wasn't someone who normally made public statements, but he couldn't let it go. "What we saw wasn't politics," he said into the camera. "It was substance sharpened by survival." That line hit the algorithm like a match to gasoline. It was printed onto protest signs, quoted in speeches, whispered in poetry slams. One rapper from Detroit opened a track with Crockett's voice. A spoken word collective in Baltimore used the entire moment as the foundation for a performance called "The Room Didn't Move, But She Did." In Houston, a tattoo artist inked Crockett's line onto a woman's forearm, just beneath a stylized Lady Justice, blindfolded with dollar bills. In Oakland, a muralist painted her image across a courthouse wall, half in shadow, half in firelight, with the words, "You don't have to shout when the truth already echoes." What made it so powerful was how unrehearsed it felt. People were used to politicians aiming for viral. This was different. She hadn't tried to go viral. She had tried to tell the truth. And that's why it worked. You could feel it. She wasn't talking to cameras. She wasn't playing for points. She was responding to someone who tried to reduce her voice, her work, her history, to a stereotype. And instead of swinging back with fire, she let the weight of her reality land like stone. And while influencers dissected it and strategists tried to reframe it, Crockett said nothing. No follow-up post, no tweet, no victory lap. She didn't retweet the edits, didn't comment on the threads. She disappeared into the background like a ghost that had already said what it came to say. And in doing so, she made it all resonate more. Because it became clear, she hadn't said it for the moment. She had said it because it needed to be said. And the silence she left behind did the rest. Journalists began asking, was this a turning point? Not for a campaign, but for how truth cuts through political spin? Not everyone agreed. Some tried to diminish it, called it a cleverly timed performance, a media-savvy maneuver. But those claims rang hollow because anyone who watched it closely could tell. She hadn't prepared that line for applause. She had lived it, and that's what gave it weight. By the end of the month, they were calling it the Crockett effect. Op-ed writers described it as a rare moment where moral clarity beat political theater. Talk show hosts, even those usually cynical about DC drama, admitted there was something different about the way she held the room. It wasn't dominance, one commentator said. It was dignity, and it made everyone else look like they were pretending. Even her critics, those who disagreed with her policies, struggled to deny her presence. They tried. They threw words like emotional, aggressive, too polished, but none of it stuck because she hadn't shouted. She hadn't fumbled. She hadn't tried to steal the room. She had earned it. And the ripple continued. An elementary school in Newark had a 6th grade essay contest titled, "What Does Justice Mean to You?" Most of the kids started their papers by quoting Crockett. One student wrote, "Justice is supposed to be fair, but some people only see money and power." Jasmine Crockett reminded the world to stop pretending. It wasn't about party. It wasn't about left or right. It was about the feeling so many people had bottled up for years that truth had become too expensive to speak. And then someone did. And maybe what made it so unforgettable was this. Jasmine Crockett didn't try to make history. She tried to tell it. And in doing so, she became part of it. For everyone else, it was a moment. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was a memory and a responsibility. The world saw 10 seconds of clarity. They shared it, praised it, broke it into pieces. But Crockett had lived every moment that led to that sentence. She had heard that tone before. The dismissiveness in Bondi's voice. The insinuation dressed up as analysis. It wasn't new. It was familiar. Too familiar. It had echoed in her law school classrooms, in courtrooms where she'd sat across from prosecutors who couldn't remember her name, but remembered her earrings. In interviews where the smile was praised, but the resume questioned. So when the cameras rolled and the microphone passed her way, she hadn't planned to make a speech. She had just reached the point where silence would have felt like surrender. And yet, after all that, she hadn't expected what came next. The messages didn't come from politicians. They came from people. Paper envelopes, faded stamps, handwritten letters, torn notebook pages, folded with care. Her staff hadn't seen anything like it. They'd received public support before, social media tags, articles, campaign donations. But this was different. It was quiet, personal, almost sacred. Letters from people who didn't know how to send emails, people who didn't have time to tweet, people who saw in her what they had always wanted to believe about themselves, that truth, even when spoken softly, could still shake the foundations. One letter came from a man serving a 22-year sentence for a crime he still claimed he didn't commit. He had watched the clip from prison, played on the shared television in the corner of the rec room. His note was written in pencil. No flourish, just raw urgency. "When you said what you said," he wrote, "the whole room went quiet. Even the guards watched. I haven't seen that happen in here in years. Another came from a high school student in Kentucky. She didn't use fancy words. She just wrote, I didn't know someone like you could talk like that and get away with it. Now I want to try. And with every new letter, Jasmine felt the weight grow, not as a burden, but as a reminder that her voice, once dismissed as too passionate or too sharp or too much, had now become something else. Permission. Permission for others to speak, to stand, to stop shrinking. She didn't respond to all the letters. There were too many, but she read them, every one. Late at night, with a mug of tea and the windows closed, some made her laugh, some broke her completely, some made her sit for long minutes, hands frozen above the pages, because the ache behind the words was too heavy to carry in one breath. These weren't political fan letters. They were confessions, testimonies, people saying, you reminded me I wasn't crazy for seeing the cracks in this system. She kept the most personal ones in a drawer in her office, not because she needed to revisit them, but because she couldn't let herself forget. The message beneath the moment wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about what happens when one person stands up, not to dominate, not to perform, but to tell the truth in a room that wasn't built to hear it. And something even more profound was happening now. People were no longer just quoting her. They were quoting themselves, empowered by what she had unlocked in them. In staff meetings, interns spoke with more confidence. In classrooms, students challenged outdated textbooks. On podcasts and panels, guests referenced her moment as a starting point, not the finish line. She hadn't closed a chapter. She had ripped the cover off the book and told people to start writing their own. But Crockett knew something most people didn't. She knew that telling the truth in public comes with a tax. Not the kind you pay with money, but with peace. Every time the clip played, someone else misquoted her, misframed her, called her lucky, called her dangerous, said she was calculating, said she was having a moment. She had to smile through interviews where the host complimented her tone but refused to talk about her policy. She had to walk into rooms where people shook her hand while quietly planning to keep her out of the next meeting. She had lived long enough inside the system to know what happens when a black woman becomes too clear to ignore. But she didn't retreat, and she didn't explain herself. Because the real message, the one no viral clip could capture, was this. She had always been that clear. The country just finally stopped looking away. And as the noise began to fade and the world moved on, as it always does, what remained wasn't the applause, or the headlines, or even the viral clip. What remained was the lesson that crawled out of that silence, the cost of truth and the courage it demands. Justice, in theory, is supposed to be blind. But Jasmine Crockett had learned the truth the hard way. Justice in America doesn't wear a blindfold. It wears a mask. And beneath that mask, it sees everything. Color, gender, power, money, name. Intent doesn't matter when systems are built on habit. And too often, those habits reward the loudest voice, not the most honest one. What she faced on that panel was not just a political attack. It was a familiar ritual, the subtle undermining of legitimacy, the soft, smug dismissal that tells you, without raising its voice, that you do not belong here, that your anger is a weakness, that your clarity is a threat, and that your presence, your very presence, is the problem. But Crockett didn't break. She didn't roar. She didn't perform. She didn't try to outpace the insult with noise. She met it with weight, with memory, with the kind of truth that doesn't need a mic drop to be final. And that's what changed everything. Because people weren't moved by how she spoke. They were moved by what she didn't do. She didn't stoop. She didn't spin. She didn't deflect. She stood her ground calmly and let the silence between sentences do the damage. That silence became the weapon. And in a political landscape addicted to spectacle, that kind of restraint was revolutionary. So what's the lesson? That power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and when it does, the people who benefit from chaos will panic. They will call your calm emotional, your truth divisive, and your courage dangerous. But they only do that because they recognize something ancient in your voice, unbought, unshaped, and unmoved. Jasmine didn't win because she outdebated Pam Bondi. She won because she didn't play the game at all. She rewrote the terms in real time, and people felt it in their bones, because many had been there before, in a classroom, a boardroom, a courtroom, told to make themselves smaller so others could feel bigger. And what does that mean for us? It means that silence is not the absence of power. It's the presence of control. It means that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay in your seat and let truth take up the space it's always been denied. It means we have to stop waiting for permission to speak like we belong and start speaking because we already do. The world doesn't change when someone yells. It changes when someone dares to speak without fear of being misunderstood. Crockett reminded us that you don't need the last word. You just need the right one. She showed us that grace under pressure is not weakness. It's defiance. That dignity is not passivity. It's power that refuses to shrink to fit inside someone else's expectations. She walked into a room that expected her to defend her place, and instead she questioned why the room was built that way to begin with. And in doing so, she didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for every voice that had ever been labeled too much just for daring to be enough. So if there's one truth to carry from this story, let it be this: that truth is not supposed to be comfortable. It's supposed to be clear. And those who benefit from confusion will always fear clarity. But clarity, spoken without apology, is a form of justice in itself. Crockett didn't raise her voice to change the room. She simply refused to lower her truth. And in a world that's constantly asking women like her to be quieter, gentler, more palatable, she chose instead to be undeniable. That is the lesson. That is the message. And no matter how loud the world becomes again, that kind of truth doesn't need volume to survive. It only needs someone brave enough to speak it, and someone strong enough to stand in the silence that follows. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.